Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to Commissioner Wilson's virtual office hours. Hi, Commissioner.
Hi, I can't believe it's been a week since the last one. This has flown by.
I know. I'm wearing my split oak shirt because we got a lot
Yeah,
of updates for the public.
that's awesome. Well, I don't have my shirt on, but if you look at the back of my computer.
Sorry for starting a little bit late. I was having some technical difficulties, but thank you all so much for joining. If you don't know by now, I'm Lee Perry and I do the constituent services, and Commissioner Wilson does these virtual office hours every Thursday so that you can talk to her live by dropping your questions in the comment box. But if you have future questions, feel free to email district1@ocfl.net or reach out, sign up for the newsletter on NicoleWilson.org and just engage with our office furthermore.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it was so funny. I had somebody ask me that had tuned into our office hours. They're like, why don't you do that in person? I'm like, well, we have in-person meetings also, which I know we're going to get to the summary of some of our in-person meetings later, but it's just a way to sort of be able to connect in another layer. And, there are no questions that are off limits. We may not be able to answer them, but we can certainly go dig around and try to find the answer. And a lot of times, if residents don't come to us with what they're seeing or hearing, we don't know about it. We can't be everywhere at once. So we're really grateful for the interaction, even if it's, not necessarily good news. It's okay. That's our job.
Exactly. So right off the bat, we had an opportunity on Monday to meet with the residents of Horizon West for a really fun and engaging meet and greet. And, I've never been to a luxury cinema before, but thank you so much for Cinepolis allowing us to host Commissioner Wilson's meet and greet there, and to all the residents who came out and spoke.
Yeah, I was, first of all, I want to say that I always feel so grateful for the residents of District 1 because they are so engaged. You don't have to look far to see that, right? So that if you check out sort of the data that comes back from any of those public surveys, if you look at the engagement when Parks and Rec does a meeting, when the Department of Planning does a meeting. And so it shouldn't surprise me, but I was still really overjoyed to see the turnout. And it was a, packed house, beautiful theater there in Horizon West. A resident actually helped us find that location. So thank you, Linda, for helping with that. I'm once again just very reliant on the people out there that are really plugged in, that say, oh, this is a good place for us to go ahead and get together and talk about this right now, since we're talking about transportation. So it was really good to get the feedback.
Yeah, and we're still collecting surveys. So if you go to ocfl.net and go to the transportation initiative, you can see the survey there. We'll be posting about it all the way up through the next couple weeks. But, the transportation sales tax is coming up, and we were asking constituents for their feedback. Maybe, Commissioner, you can talk a little bit about what residents brought to your attention.
First of all, I want to say that if you've done a survey, don't feel like it's wasted. We actually got all of the information, and even the open-ended questions were given to us in full sentence answer. And I will say that for the vast majority of the times that I've spoken up about the transportation sales tax, you all in your surveys reflected what I was saying. And there were, an overwhelming number of people who agree that what we have going on right now is not working and that we need more options. There was a lot of focus on safe pedestrians, safe bicyclists, complete streets, right? Where people have options. They can go out and utilize either a wider path for whatever it is they need to, utilize. It's not a car, or a protected bike lane. There was a lot of asks for protected bike lanes. And you all know what those unprotected bike lanes look like. We've got the space for a bike lane, but there's just a paint stripe that's supposed to keep people from feeling like they're going to get hit by a car. I wouldn't ride my bike to work under any circumstances if an unprotected bike lane was all I had as an option. So seeing that reflected in our surveys made me feel like, okay, we're on the right track. We're moving in the right direction. I think having the rest of the board see your surveys is also very helpful, because I think District 1, and specifically Horizon West, has some challenges that aren't common to every area across Orange County. So having that feedback from the residents of that area, it's really important. They have their own challenges, and people, I think, often sort of paint with this broad brush that is an area that's shiny and new and has no problems. Well, that's not the case. A lot of places out there are really struggling with lagging infrastructure or infrastructure design that didn't really match the needs of that community to be a walkable, bikeable community. So we just have to keep working on it regardless of what happens with the transportation sales tax.
Awesome. Well, that hearing for the transportation sales tax is going to be on Tuesday, April 26th after 2 o'clock. So stay tuned. And if you can come out and share your story, please do.
Yeah, I mean, stay engaged with this because I think the thing that I heard from residents about what I want to raise as a concern, and especially District 1 residents, was that they feel very underrepresented when it comes to all of the issues that popped up on that survey, right? So when you look at the things that have been presented so far from staff and from the teams that have been working on the transportation sales tax plan, so we got links, we've got information from Sunrail, we've got the traffic people from our division and the municipalities. It seems to have sort of a gaping hole in these areas where there's been a lot of growth in population. So I keep saying, look, if you know that the census says we've grown here, why aren't we seeing more of those options? And I haven't gotten all the answers yet. They're hearing me. I know that. So Links did come back with some more, a variety of plans that may be able to be implemented. And we're continuing to have the conversation about east-west connections because it just hasn't really been addressed.
Absolutely. So I'm looking forward to continuing to engage on that conversation. When we talk about transportation, you have to talk about urban sprawl and you have to talk about congestion and all the challenges that coincide with that. There's a lot to educate people on. And with what went down yesterday, I think this is a perfect example of how to bring everyone to the table on how transportation can impact our environment. So Split Oak Forest, maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about that with some history and talk about where we're at now.
Okay, so let's back up because I think you absolutely right, but you had so much in that sentence that I want to break it out a little bit. So when we think about urban sprawl and we think about our housing difficulties, people say, well, how do you balance the growth that we're seeing with the need for more housing? And there is a misperception out there that I'm anti-growth or anti-development. And I want to debunk that right out of the gate and say that it's about the way we grow. And I think that there are so many opportunities here in Orange County to grow up, not out. And if we grow up, not out, then the people in that area it becomes a more vibrant place, right? You have an area that's creating more demands. You've got a good workforce for economic incentives for companies to come, good high wage paying companies. And then you can also focus your transit and your transportation investments near those populations. For a very long time here in Florida, the idea has just been to keep pushing out, right? You add a plan for some new large plan development on the edge of town. And then everyone that lives in a little bit further gets the impacts from that, right? Their roads get wider and more congested. Their air quality decreases. Their last remaining rural spaces start to disappear. And that's really where Florida is right now, is that we've never said we need to go up and not out. We need to look at places to densify that are inside our urban boundaries. And Split Oak Forest is a perfect example of where we went wrong, because if you think about the need they're saying that they're asking for a toll road in an area that really doesn't connect to anything right now, but there is a planned development for the other side of that. So, if our policy across the board, and I mean not just here in Orange County, but like as a growth management principle in the state of Florida was to incentivize density in places that it makes sense, I don't think we'd be having the split forest conversation, because I don't think we would have the ability for the deep-pocketed development interest to say, well, we've already got rights to do what we want to on the other side of that. So you better get us there. And that's what we're dealing with. Split Oak Forest is in a mitigation land. It was actually brought to the Board of County Commissioners in the 90s by the then sitting leadership in Orange and Osceola County as a mitigation for development, including our convention center. And so, mitigation basically is this idea that I'm going to wreck this here, or I'm going to destroy, or I'm going to fill, or I'm going to build on a resource or something of value here, but then I'm going to invest in something out there somewhere else and save it forever because I'm affecting this here. And split oak forest, in part, and there's lots of parts that came together to make it what it is today, but in part was mitigation for this really impactful development in places that were sensitive, near the headwaters of the Everglades and, all over actually South District 1. So, people are like, oh, that's not in your district. And I'm like, no, listen, there's a couple things we got to make sure that we're being really clear about. Split oak forest right now is held, the ownership is public. It's a public piece of land and it was paid for by tax dollars. So even if I wasn't a leader here, I would still be really concerned about what you were doing with my tax dollars. And to say that the cheapest way to get this toll road put in is to cut across public lands tells you we haven't valued them correctly. So there's so many layers to the problem with what I feel like is the Central Florida Expressway Authority's plan to go through split oak forest. They should never have approached split oak like the cheapest way to get there. I've been engaged about this issue for 4 years now. And every time I think that we're finally getting to the point where we're making the point, we get a setback. And this week was a huge setback because split oak was part of an overall statewide investment into conservation lands. And FCT, which is Florida Conservation Trust, acts as the manager for the grants that help paid for the down payment for split oak forest. So they were able to operate as a guardian in a way and as a gatekeeper for any applications to take any part of split oak forest. So this was an opportunity for them to look, at this plan, Lee, and say, you know what, actually, there's nothing in here that says anything about an alternative route. And it is a statutory requirement that they can only do this if there's no alternative route. And there was nothing about their analysis of the other routes not being feasible. The issue is they're not affordable. They couldn't do it because they couldn't pay to do it. So, there was a fail there because FCT could have called them on that. FCT really has the requirement to step down a checklist if they're allowing conservation land to get taken. And part of that checklist is, for what purpose is this conservation land being taken? And there's 2 or 3 categories. There's more than one category, but the 2 categories that were in play in this case, in Split Oak's case, were the idea of a land swap, which is what was essentially being proposed, and the idea of a linear facility. And for purposes of statutory description, a linear facility is something that goes in across a piece of property that doesn't really have massive impacts. In fact, the words they use in the statute are minimal impacts. And it's a power line, it's a water pipe, it's a sidewalk. It has been a linear facility. I have never seen a case of the linear facility statute being used for a toll road, for an expressway, for a multi-laned 60-acre, not including the 100 that get severed, toll one. So that's a precedent, okay, for them to apply for a toll road under the linear facilities statute. And the reason why they did that, there's 2 kind of big reasons. The first one is, and they were clear about this at the meeting this week, is because they don't have to then transfer ownership, right? So they're saying that the constitutional protection that lies in public lands doesn't even come into play here because they're not transferring ownership, that they're just allowing the use of an easement. We're just going across it for this power line is the purpose of that legal designation. The idea that you're applying that to a toll road is absurd if you think about it, because typically easements for facility utilities can be removed, right? We've seen it all the time. Every 2 weeks, we see things like what may have been planned for an extension of some infrastructure, pipeline, wires, core, for internet, that they decide not to go that way, and they just, they pull it, and there's not a big deal. But to do that for a toll road sort of minimizes this idea that those impacts will never be reversible. And so it really actually needed to have come under a different approval process. In addition, because Tavistock and Desiree Ranches have offered to, and I'm going to use the air quotes, and I don't really like air quotes, but donate an additional piece of land if this piece of land goes to the Expressway Authority. It's a land swap, right? So it's not a donation if you have, if it's requiring another piece of property to come into possession for something else. And there's a different statute for that. And that statute requires a different approval process that I don't think that they could have gotten. They wouldn't have gotten the numbers they needed for that approval process. And the scrutiny is higher because they would have had to prove that that land swap land was as valuable or higher value. And so they skipped over all that. They took a shortcut. It was never analyzed. It was really, to me, a very disappointing scene. I'm not totally shocked because Noah Valentine, who was sort of the person that directed the motion for approval and ushered through this approval process without any real discussion. He was the director of the Department of Environmental Protection under Rick Scott when the worst of the worst things happen in our environment. So it shouldn't come as a shock to anybody. None of those people that set up there have any scientific background. And I just was disappointed because the law is so clear. And that was the part that was hard. I think the other part that was hard for me, I want you to hear what you think about this when I'm done, was seeing that Orange County residents who have spoken loud and clear about this didn't get any representation from anyone but me. And I am one person. And I looked over there by the Osceola County attorneys and the Central Florida Expressway administrators. And that's where our EPD was sitting and conferring. And that's where our legal department was sitting and conferring. And it was like I had a light bulb moment that the people weren't being represented there. It just, to me, was that was a disappointment.
Yeah, I mean, I was disappointed too, and always I feel like I'm naive because at a certain point I'm like, when does the accountability come in? You know, we as voters did everything that we thought, and I guess we can talk about how the charter amendment's going to come into play after this, but you know, we rallied, we fundraised, we got this on the ballot, we voted in 2020. And even though the original application was voted on in 2019, you would think that we sent a very clear message as a community to all of the elected officials and to the representatives and staff that this is what the people want and need. And, you know, the other way that I feel personally is sitting now in the process where every 2 weeks, you're basically getting outvoted on land use cases where we're seeing wetlands being chipped away at every 2 weeks. And it's like, can't we just have one thing? Can we have one? I mean, 1,700 acres in retrospect isn't that big of a deal. It's so small in comparison to, in terms of like the protections that I think Split Oak deserves, in comparison to the hundreds of acres every 2 weeks that we're seeing just get disregarded as valuable outside of how it can profit a developer. You know, where's the value of those trees, of the wildlife, of anything? And if we are ever going to respect the value of nature, let's respect it in Split Oak, like we said to the voters we would do when we put it into conservation back in the 90s, you know?
Exactly. And, you know, an even bigger point to distinguish Split Oak from the land use cases that we see regularly. And I do fight for every piece of what I feel like will be damaged. Anytime I see any wetland impacts, I apply our charter amendment, right? So we also voted for the right to clean water. In that charter amendment, the people of Orange County basically got the right to say, you can't do that to my water bodies here in Orange County as an Orange County resident. And if you do, I can actually help be a guardian in court for that water body. I know it's being actually tried in a court next week and we don't know what the outcome is, but what I do know is that the voters spoke that that's what they wanted. They wanted those protections and they were really clear about it. That was the highest I've ever seen any local referendum come in at as an approval. And so that shows you that that's a huge priority. Well, as a local commissioner, then my job is to make sure I'm infusing that in every single decision, right? So anytime I see a land use plan that has wetland impacts, surface, you know, body water impacts, anything that it's going to have, I'm so sorry, my phone
Do 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 do. Sometimes you just have to improvise a little bit. We have a brief break of technical difficulties, so please hold. And in the meantime, I will hum a little song. Um, I just have to say, while Commissioner's getting her camera back on, um, the Split Oak Forest is one conservation area. It's basically like a canary in a coal mine that I feel is one of the most well protected conservation areas that we have. Oh, that's okay. Hi, welcome back.
Technical difficulties in me are like this, right? Sorry about that.
Well, I was just saying, because I learned so much from you, Commissioner, on like legal standing and precedents and what that means when it comes to future cases where other conservation areas could be at risk. You said that Split Oak Forest is one of the most well protected forests in the entire state in terms of like putting it into a trust and having legal barriers to make sure that it's never touched. What could this do to future conservation lands if we chip away at it and then battle this out in court and lose?
Listen, this was the concern of, and I mean, how many different organizations were in the room? I mean, we had the Legal Men voters, we had the Florida conservation voters, and they all had, in the original author, by the way, of some of the language in Florida Communities Trust, which is that grant program for the state, was a law professor at Stetson University, somebody who I consider, I put him on a platform, and anytime I get to work with him, I feel like I'm working with, legal greatness. He wrote a letter to Florida Communities Trust and said that if this happens, that there is the possibility of nothing being off limits. If this meets the threshold for things that can be allowed on public conservation lands, that there's really no stopping what that interpretation could open. So having those sort of broader implications for what our protections are under the state constitution and under the different agencies and statutes that supply those agencies with their rules, this really goes around all of those things and makes like a loophole in the law. So the land use cases, and this is what I think I was trying to say before I cut myself off on the TV on Zoom, but the loophole. Okay, so when we see cases, most of the time in Orange County in our land use that we are so frustrated with, we're dealing with private property owners and private developers, right? So we don't have, private property rights are so powerful, and we don't have a lot of opportunity to really claw back any wetlands even that are impacted, but we can say that this part of this piece of property needs to be off limits. That's where our space is, right? With Split Oak Forest or anything that's been designated through the state of Florida under Florida conservation lands statutes isn't private property, it's public property. It was purchased with your tax dollars, my tax dollars. It was managed with tax money, which means that the management that's happened over the last 30 years, that's an ongoing investment. So to act like that asset has no value or to not pay back, I think, the public for taking it, and it's a taking. Call it what it is, a taking. So a taking is a constitutional principle that if somebody walks into your house today and says to you, Lee, your house is going to become an airport because we need an airport right here. You don't just get out of the way and let them build an airport. They have to pay you the full value of your property. And it's a very strong law nationally because it's part of our constitutional protections. But in Florida, we have even like more of those built on. We actually have additional property rights that protect private property owners. So when you think about like the idea of doing this to the public as a property owner here, right? This is our property, a public purchased and maintained property. Everybody should be outraged because it means that the taking is disregarded if it's public land, that because it was purchased with tax dollars, that somehow you're not taking it for a different use. Well, the use that it was purchased for was conservation. It was purchased for mitigation and conservation. So if you're going to take it, then you better pay us what you would be paying um, for full value of this type of land. And then we get somewhere, right? Because it's the whole reason they want to go this way. The whole reason they want to go this way is all about the money, because it was cheaper for them to steal it from the public than it was for them to purchase it on the open market. And that's the part that really frustrates me. People, I got asked today, why would you dig your heels in on this? This is like, there's so much growth and there's so many bigger problems. I know that. I can walk and chew gum. Well, sometimes I can't, but I think the issue about Split Oak really gets to people and should get to you because it's yours, because it's owned by you, the public. And we have so few of those left, and we have so few opportunities to even get more. So then I get the question, Lee, and I know you've heard this too. Well, why wouldn't you go with this? You're going to get a land swap. This is going to be a great deal. Well, because if you're promising me new property to make up for my existing property, which, by the way, was given to me because you took my last property, how is it making the next one safe, right? Like, I've already broken a promise. I'm going to break another promise, giving you a promise. I mean, to me, the idea of mitigating mitigation and then mitigating that mitigation should like really rattle everybody, because it means that nothing is safe. So this property was mitigation for other damage. To take it and then to donate this land swap as mitigation for that, or whatever they're saying it's for, I think they have, 2 or 3 different descriptions, isn't sufficient. Now, I'm like all about a land donation, donate it, right? Like if Tavistock and Desiree Ranch want to put a piece of land in conservation, I'm all for that. We try to help people with that every single day. But if you're doing it just because you want the cut through and you want the cut through to go through public land, then it's not a donation. It's quid pro quo. It's a deal, and it's a crappy deal for the public. So I think it makes a bigger deal, a lot more sense when I talk about it in ways of all the impacts it could have on all the conservation property across the state. And it should terrify everybody. This happened at our state agency that they literally have the word trust in their name.
Right. And, there's a lot there too, because they don't have information on that land that they're donating to us, whether it has any ecological value in comparison to the ecological value, which we don't quantify when we're talking about costs or negotiating, right, as Toll Road would go. If you heard, which we'll cut it up and share it, if you heard Valerie Anderson, who is the champion of the Friends of Split Oak, if you heard her go through her presentation at the Berry Law Rights of Nature Symposium, the history of Split Oak, that southern region, has some of the most flourishing and biodiverse ecological ecosystems in the entire forest. So they're severing some of the most critical habitats, but then giving us potentially junk land.
Yeah.
That saying is, oh, it's 1,500 acres. It's so much more than what we would be taking if we basically severed that property in half with this toll road. They're not being honest about habitat fragmentation and what that does. They're not being, because habitat fragmentation, for those of you, quick ecology 101, when you cut through forests that have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of building that biodiversity and building up those various plants and animals that live in unison with each other, when you cut through that, you're doing damage, not just to that area, but to the buffer areas all around it, and then causing
it severs
an ecological collapse. Whether it's a bridge or not, you're causing a lot of ecological collapse, not to mention all the pollution from the cars and runoff. And we'll leave that for another day. But, then you also have the fact that when a gopher tortoise, for example, goes to eat something like, gopher apple, like the plants that grow as a plant cover on the ground, it grows horizontally. Something like a fire helps clear a lot of the shrubs, which is a natural occurrence, so that that plant can grow again and again and help make room for sunlight to come in. Controlled burns are really essential for habitat health. You can't burn if a road is right there, because you can't close the road and let a fire run across the area. So you're now causing long-term impacts to the food and nutrient resources for these animals, as one example. So the list goes on and on and on of how their ideas behind this land swap, basically, or donation, would be less effective for the people who put it into conservation to preserve the animals there in their peak of health.
Exactly. It's so well said. I think there's a real disconnect between the people who are really trying to push this through and what actually happened at Split Oak Forest. And that's the part that's very interesting to listen to the scientists on, because they will tell you that this has been an active management and, like, sort of a resource pooling of experts to bring this type of ecosystem into place. And the idea of just running something up and over it that's not going to damage it is crazy. We know the danger of smoke and highways. We know once visibility goes down, and especially in an area where there's going to be a curve, that you can't do that. Rightfully, it would be a absolute disaster and a huge safety risk. So that would be the end of the controlled burns, and controlled burns are the way that many, many, many of those species are able to regenerate. So yeah,
Right.
there's not a good understanding about those issues with the people that should know the most about it, right? I think about our teachers. Our teachers are often the totally left out of the conversations about curriculum. We got lawmakers up there with who knows what kind of background, pushing around books and trying to get on, their political theater stage. It should be teachers making these decisions. We should have teachers making those decisions. It's no different here, where we had, how many scientists do you think got up and said, the reason why you can't do this is, and then laid out the reasons. And then we get the politician from Osceola County who comes up and he's like, well, it was man-made anyway. And I'm like, he's taking credit for a tree or a gopher tortoise. I'm confused. Horrible, right? Like, it was just an atrocious thing to say, that he thought
Right.
because we conserved something that we created something. No, God created that. That was nature. Let Mother Nature get credit for that. But yeah, you conserved up until now. Does that mean that you have the right to destroy it? I don't think so. I don't
No.
think so.
Well, another point to bring up, the irony, you brought up money, that this is all about money. And someone had spoke, I think it was Chuck O'Neill, had made in his comment that there's $100 million on the table here. There are other routes of private landowners who are coming ready to sign a deal saying, take my private property, but you're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
And they are trying to say, no, we want it on the cheap. We want it subsidized by taxpayer dollars. But in the same week, in the same less than 7 days from yesterday, we're going to talk about adding a tax for residents to pay for future transportation needs. The irony of this is that, why are you not pushing back on Central Florida Expressway? You, as in the board who is maybe trying to progress a transportation sales tax on residents. Why are you not pushing back on Central Florida Expressway and saying, if you want Split Oak Forest, here's our price, and we're going to factor in the ecological impact of this forest that taxpayers have pumped a lot of money into preserving and helping to maintain. So it would probably be more expensive if we had a full board that really worked as hard as you do, Commissioner, to fight for the value of Split Oak Forest. So not only are they doing a disservice to the forest, they're just doing a disservice to how much money we could be bringing in if we actually quantified the value of Split Oak in this route.
So true. It is so true. And I think so let's draw all these lines, right? So we've been talking about the transportation sales tax. Week before that, and I mean, this has been an ongoing conversation, we've talked about our difficulties in housing and housing cost. Now let's tag on the end and talk about the destruction of conservation land. And people are like, well, those are all different issues. I'm like, no, actually, this should all be one conversation. We need to have an understanding that, like, doing the good growth, places where there's transportation and transit in place, will both provide more housing, less need for single car ridership, which will help the planet in more than one way, but it also helps people that are potentially trying to work their way up the ladder in their profession, or that really just want to ride their bike or walk. And we don't have to go out into the burbs and eat up more rural and conservation lands. So the fact that nobody talks about that holistically tells you everything you need to know about our growth management. And the idea that I bring up oftentimes, why aren't we incentivizing redevelopment? We have go down 50, right? I would love to see an east-west connection, some kind of a light rail, heavy rail, monorail, I don't care. East-west, right? We've talked about needing it because we know the population growth has been on the east side and the west side. And there was no plan in that for the last 2 times that we've seen their plans brought up. You go from downtown all the way out to the end of Orange County on 50, and you could probably, count 12, 14, 15 either underutilized or completely empty strip malls. Commercial, industrial zone, sometimes they're institutional zone, but for the most part, you're talking about a zoning prohibition to put in housing. But they have transportation right now in that they're on a bus route at the very least, which some areas of District 1 don't even have that. And they're close to quite a few of the bigger employers. Well, we have made it so difficult for those infill type of and redevelopment opportunities that it's cheaper for developers to go out to the end, take a look at a forest and go, you know what, I'd rather just do it here. And so that's what happened on the east side of town. And you look at that area around Boggy Creek and Arcoosie, and it was just cheaper for them to keep marching on out and taking down the forest than it was to go back, find a piece of commercial property, figure out how to navigate all of our prohibitive code to make an investment. So, and I just hope that if I say it enough, we'll start hearing it, that we need to be able to make those investments on redevelopment projects. We shouldn't have to close our doors to housing so that we can have conservation, because that's the other part that I hear, right? We get the folks from Orlando Economic Partnership, or we get the folks from the various chambers of commerce that are saying that this is not good for the economy to decide not to put a road in where we need a road. And my what I want to say to that, my rebuttal to that is that we need to have that conservation, that park space, to have a good economy. No one wants to come here without some green space, without beautiful natural spaces. And we're still going to do better if we figure out how to get the blight out of the areas that have been either underdeveloped or have been abandoned because it was cheaper at the other end. These are all zoning and planning issues. But to talk about it on the board, when they're talking about transportation, they are like, we're not talking about that today. It was like the time I tried to bring up pedestrians when we were looking at a roadway improvement. And I said, well, that looks like it's too wide. How does the pedestrian get across? And I heard, we're not talking about that today. This is about the roadway. This is about transportation. Pedestrians are transportation. Bikers are transportation. And ultimately, people who are transporting need places to live, and they need to be close to their schools and their work. So this, it's not rocket science. I'm not an urban planner, but I know that if we don't figure out how to make profitable projects out of that redevelopment, we're just going to be out of any forest altogether. We're not going to have any open spaces left. So we need to densify in the interior of our urban areas. And we need to protect wherever we can on those outskirts and making sure that there are open spaces.
Absolutely. Urban sprawl is more expensive. That's something that they're not saying out loud. When we're building way outside of that urban corridor and people have to be car dependent in order to just live and function, it's more expensive for everyone. Maintaining a car is way more expensive than having a bus pass or a pass to the Sunrail. You have so many long-term maintenance requirements and needs for maintaining a car, not to mention the cost of gas, not to mention your time in a 45-minute commute just to get to work and then a 45-minute commute to get home. That's time away from your families. That's time away from your self-care. And we are keeping people way outside of that urban corridor by continuing to pass irresponsible growth. Not to mention, Commissioner, you know this firsthand because you're seeing it come. We have like 3 pages of agenda review every long range agenda meeting where it's luxury apartments or single family housing that maybe starts in the $550,000 range that just isn't equitable or attainable for the real everyday people who are being pushed out of their properties right now and maybe even living on the streets or in their cars. So let's not put lipstick on a pig, as you like to say.
Right. It's exactly right. I mean, if, and it's so insulting when I have a developer or applicant in front of me who said, if I'm trying to kind of ask questions about their development plan in an undeveloped green space, and they'll say, well, that's going to affect affordable housing. Is it going to be affordable, or is that what are you going to promise that? And that's where that conversation ends, because it's, they're not willing to give that up. And I think, when you said it's more expensive, I think you got to make sure that you're being completely clear to the people who are watching this. It is more expensive to the resident, right? To the existing resident. It's not more expensive to the developer. And that's where our problem lies. That's our biggest hurdle, is that we need to make it more expensive to do the sprawl thing and less expensive, more enticing to do the infill and the redevelopment. Right. And I think, if we look at what success that we have in areas where there is a community redevelopment plan, right? We've heard the CRA acronym kind of thrown around in iDrive, but really, if you look at downtown Winter Garden, downtown Claremont, that those areas where you've seen good infill redevelopment, it's because they've invested in stabilizing the property tax and allowing residents to reinvest, and allowing businesses to invest, in incentivizing that development right there, very localized development. So it's something that we, have to see globally. We have to see it across our county, because I think it applies not just to District 1. I know there's challenges they have on the east side. I know on the south. I know, if you go northeast or northwest. So the concepts aren't just District 1. I just think District 1 has probably some of the most vocal residents seeing those challenges. And because the pace out there of the development is so fast, and people will drive to work one day and there's a forest, to the right of them on their way out their neighborhood. And the next day they go get up and it's gone. And they, rightfully call and they're like, what happened? Well, lo and behold, this was a piece of property that back when whoever was in charge 20 years ago said, oh, this may someday want to be a housing development of some kind. And we locked it in right there. But we have to be able to make choices now for our residents now. And we have to be able to say right now where that density makes the most sense, because we don't have enough space to keep adding lanes. So if we're putting housing out there and we're not going to add any more lanes, then what are we going to do? We need more transit. We need more convenient and affordable transit options. We need choices, and we need to make sure that we're keeping our pedestrians and our bikes safe, because every one of those that's safe is one less car on your road. And then on top of it, we need to make sure that we're welcoming people here who are moving here into areas that they know they can get to their work and get to their school without having to drive 30 minutes across town. And that's the only way we're going to be able to grow. It's the only way we're going to be able to grow.
Absolutely. Don't let them say that every time a new road goes in, it's to help with congestion, because sometimes those roads really are helping add to congestion. So don't even play. Okay, so moving on, there's a motion to dismiss judicial hearing coming up on April 26th regarding the right to clean water and the keys to protect Lake Mary Jane. Maybe you can just give a brief overview for people who are tuning into that.
Okay, so this is a very interesting case. Sadly, I'm going to be in the Board of County Commissioners meeting, so I'm not going to be able to attend the hearing. And we're all talking about important things that day. But the right to clean water was voted in by I think an unheard of, an unprecedented number of residents here in Orange County in 2020. And it speaks to the idea of being able to protect our water bodies, our surface waters, and our wetlands, any type of really the natural assets, right? There was a lot of criticism when it first came up that it would make your HOAs, more expensive, and that it would affect your property insurance. But it has nothing to do with the man-made structures. It has everything to do with the natural structures and the importance of what they do in our world, right? So they should have the intrinsic value to be protected and to be able to regenerate and to thrive. But they also, because we rely on them, we should have the right to protect those in court. So the Right to Clean Water Charter Amendment actually provided for a right of standing on behalf of a water body for citizens of Orange County. And it provided that right to the water bodies to be able to thrive and to live without being polluted. And, the idea of keeping pollution out of our waters here in Florida particularly sensitive issue, right? Because we've had red tide, we have dead manatees. People really, really want to see something different. And I think the critics back then and to today, what they'll tell you is we don't need that because we've got the EPA, we have the Department of Environmental Protection, and we have the EPD. But you just heard me talking about the Florida DEP and who runs things there. They're not scientists necessarily that are in the decision making seats, they're politicians. And so what we need to do is be able to give those protections in a way that is can be upheld in court, right? So we think about rights, and people say, well, you cannot give a lake rights, you can't give a river rights. I'm like, we gave corporations rights, we give municipalities have rights, we have a lot of things out there. Infants have rights, people who can't speak have rights, elderly folks have rights. If you're in a coma, you have rights. And people are like, but if you can't speak for your own rights, you don't have rights. I'm like, there are many things, but the one that I think is the most egregious for people to like grapple with is this corporations have rights thing. The idea that a lake or a body of water that's literally preserving life here on planet Earth doesn't have the right to defend itself in court from pollution, but a corporation that's being, that its contract was somehow messed up can come after you as an entity, as a legal entity, because it has rights. So we have to make sure that we're really careful when we talk about personhood and rights, that we're being descriptive about everything in our law that already has that. And why wouldn't we do that for lakes and rivers, understanding their integral role in the well-being of our entire population?
Absolutely. So, I look at it as it is our rights because we are nature and we need water to survive. And as of right now, for all I see, when we talk about water quality, most of the time EPD is talking about invasive species, so spraying, they're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus. They're not, which by the way, 90% of our water bodies in Orange County are impaired with like mercury and lead and et cetera. But we're not going above and beyond and looking at anything outside of the state standard, which the state standard is ridiculously low. We're even seeing that sometimes the state standard is actually lower than what the standard that's directly tied to chemical exposure leading to cancers and some things like mercury, for example. Our standard is very low. But what are we doing to fix and repair the bodies of water? And what does that mean for us long term? If we're growing and growing and our water facilities are not taking certain chemicals out of our water, then what does that mean as we grow and we just continue to look at the bare minimum of water quality qualifications? One major thing I know for a fact, because I asked point blank, do we test for all the pharmaceuticals in our reused and reclaimed water? And right now we are not testing for when we're doing reclaimed water, any of the pharmaceuticals. That all adds up and goes somewhere. If a bunch of people are taking medications and flushing that down the toilet, it all adds up somewhere. And if we're not doing our due diligence to make sure that we're testing for those chemicals, what could we be doing to our future generations as it starts to, add up? And so exactly. I just feel like there's certain rules that we are trying to put in place and to protect bodies of water so that people can be protected too. It's not just nature is outside of us. And so why would you give that body of water a legal right? It's our right too, to have the ability to sue, to protect ourselves, to have access to clean water.
Exactly. That is so well said. I think there's the disconnect between our role in this, and people think it's kind of a woo thing where you're like, rights nature, but the idea is that without having that legal tool that allows us to go in and say, you can't pollute this body of water because you're affecting not just the water body, but anybody that depends on it, swims in it, drinks from it. It doesn't actually get to come to you under our current law, which I know people are like, oh yeah, it does, if you know that they're polluting. Well, under current law, really, property rights are really limited to the people who are affected by it. So if I drank out of that and got poisoned and I was harmed, yes, then I would have a right. If I lived somewhere that had a waterfront, right? I'm on the waterfront and something is coming onto my land and it's killing my animals, then I would have a right to sue. But if those things aren't in place, then there is no right to do that. There's no right to say you can't do this anymore. And environmental attorneys back, through the years had to be really creative in figuring out how to stop things in court. And quite honestly, sometimes they fail. The most probably famous standing case that they teach in law school is based on actually some protections for the Endangered Species Act and the idea of somebody tried to enforce the Endangered Species Act. And what they said in that case was that the organization that was trying to enforce didn't have the right to enforce because they weren't harmed and there was no redressability. The court couldn't do anything to redress it. And they tried to make the argument that they were stepping in the shoes of this endangered species. And the court said that doesn't tee up, it doesn't square up with the principles of mootness and ripeness and redressability. And those are all things that are required under our law right now to provide a remedy in court. So the idea of being able to just try to take care of all of it in our current process, to your point about our environmental protection division, is that they really just are compliance, right? There's nothing proactive. And quite frankly, what happens is they're giving out permits, and permits are inherently permission to do something. You are permitting someone to take something, some water out of the ground. You're permitting somebody to leave a pile of something somewhere. You're permitting somebody, the ability to build something. And all of those, none of those are about protection. They're about permission. And so to some extent, every single time we evaluate anything in that process, the permitting process, we're allowing some level of degradation. And there's no balance to that. There's no counterbalance to that. There's no checks and balances out there. And I always kind of scratch my head at the idea of stakeholder meetings for things that are dealing with pollution and dealing with water quality or dealing with our environment, because there really is no way to get the stakeholders in the room. There's no way to get them all sitting down because the water body can't come in and do that under our current law. So those stakeholders really just have property rights as people or as corporations. So it's not a woo-woo idea. It's an idea for how we're going to be able to actually keep our water clean, or any type of semblance of healthy environment, which, just like you said, is us. That's us. How are we going to exist without it? So, and like the biggest examples of places where really, you think of the tragedies, like the environmental tragedies that have happened out in our world, and under a different paradigm of legal protections, they wouldn't have happened. So, we're trying really hard. I'm trying really hard every time a vote comes up in the county to apply what the voters asked for in that right to clean water amendment. And I know that it's still, being litigated in court, but it doesn't mean that we don't know what they were asking for. They were asking for additional protections. And if there's a way to do that legally and making sure that residents can, safely swim and drink their water and kayak and let their dogs play around in it without getting hurt, then that's our obligation. So I try really hard to make sure that people know that charter amendment, even though it hasn't been statutorily enforced by Orange County, I am trying every chance I get to enforce it through the work that comes out of our office and every vote I take.
Very well said. Well, last but not least, Bird Island, we received a lot of constituents emailing about Bird Island. And I'm curious because we talk about the right to clean water and the right to nature movement. And there are other tools in our toolbox, like putting islands for migratory birds into conservation land. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what's going on with that and where we should look forward to seeing this going.
Yeah, exactly. Bird Island is exactly one of those places that was tucked away by a nonprofit organization that was investing in conservation lands, put it away, had, identified many species that were either imperiled or were of interest. Very specifically, this was a perfect nesting site for some species. And so they put it in conservation. There's nothing on there. There's no physical structures on there. And because it's beautiful, and I mean beautiful, beautiful, and the waters right around it are very clear, it became a very popular spot for boaters, swimmers, partiers, which kind of grew and grew and grew as our population has grown over the years. And for as long as I can remember, which is, I mean, I've been here for 25 years, we've been going out there. There have been concerns about the increased degradation of Bird Island and the increased foot traffic, human waste that's left behind, garbage from partying, and boat impacts because people were allowed to just beach their boat right on the preserve. I think there was a misconception out there that this was public land, public as in like this was something that was like a beach and that everybody could use it, and that somebody would be coming by later to clean it up. And it's not. It was actually held just for those conservation purposes. And so trying to get at how to keep people safe out there were some really horrible accidents. And at the same time, conserving it for what its purpose was took a lot of effort by people in our Environmental Protection Division in conjunction with Florida Wildlife and the Sheriff's Department and the Butler Chain of Lakes Advisory Board, the Windermere Police Department. This was a really a multi-disciplinary, a multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency collaboration over the last year. My predecessor brought this up as a concern for residents, and the staff picked it up and ran with it, did a number of public-facing meetings. We understood really early on this wasn't going to get to all the problems, that this was definitely going to be part of a solution, but it wasn't going to get to all the problems. And City of Windermere really supported it. The water boards that are out there really supported it, and law enforcement supported it. So it did come before the work session, a BCC work session, I guess a month ago now, right? And at that work session, there was really no opportunity for the board to vote. There wasn't even really an ask about consensus. There was just an opportunity for staff to present, and then for the holder of the conservation easement to present, and then law enforcement had some time to present. City of Windermere never got up to say anything. They didn't feel like there was a need, and the commissioners from the City of Windermere didn't. Also, they were there in the room, and I was really thinking we were going to discuss some of the issues that have happened out there, knowing that the update to the ordinance, the safety ordinance, might be applicable in other places. I don't really know to this day what happened. The mayor had a couple questions about whether or not we were talking about safety or whether we were talking about the environment. And I, tried to make the point that I think sometimes those things are directly overlapped. For instance, a broken glass can hurt a human and a bird. And so knowing that people who have, dock their boats right there, they beach their boats, they get out, they have their coolers, they're tromping around the island, that because their props are close to other swimmers and because they're out and doing stuff, they're doing damage, but it's also dangerous to the people there. So both those things apply, and understanding that this isn't going to be the magic fix for everything, having a swim buffer, having some buoys out there to buffer people off the coast of the island will at least provide law enforcement with the ability to kind of glance over and say, okay, I see a boat smack on the sand over there, I'm going over. Whereas now, if they think something's going on, they think there's damage being done, they think there's something unsafe, by the time they get there, people just jump right back in their boats. And they were like, I wasn't trespassing, I wasn't on the island. So, I know it puts law enforcement in a difficult situation. I had thought we were getting closer to something to get going with, knowing there would be some more opportunities down the road for updates. But it was pulled from the next agenda, and we have not heard yet when it's coming back.
Well, stay tuned, everyone. Please sign up for the newsletter at NicoleWilson.org, email district1@ocfl.net. Any closing sentiments, Commissioner?
I kind of want to make sure I'm being clear about the way that got pulled. We got an email that basically said that there were questions from the board, and that's why they pulled it. And there was no board direction taken. So I keep asking what that means and what rule of procedure they're using. And I'll let you know as soon as I hear. The second that we get a date on that, I will let you know. I believe Split Oak should be coming back to the Board of County Commissioners. And I hope this time that they do the right thing by their voters, and they do the right thing by residents, and they do the right thing by the taxpayers who paid for Split Oak Forest. And I can't think of any other closing thoughts right now. Oh, transportation. Tuesday is the vote. If you have any feedback now, please, please, this is the time. I want to hear from you. We are getting those results from the survey updated. So please keep doing that. Let me know what your thoughts are. And, I am continuing to really make sure that I'm paying very close attention to other voices in that whole conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And we'll see you next week.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for going late.